Adrian Kowalczyk was 43 years old, and he had learned something most men take a lifetime to understand. The quietest rooms hold the loudest truths. He had lived by that for 11 years. 11 years of pre-dawn drives through the gray of Hamilton mornings, of concrete dust in his collar and blueprints rolled under his arm, of holding his tongue at dinner parties while his wife's colleagues talked about square footage and quarterly returns, as though the people who actually built those buildings were somewhere else entirely. Which, in their minds, they were. On a Wednesday evening in late November, standing in the kitchen of their Ancaster home with the smell of someone else's cologne already in the air, he heard 26 words that made every one of those 11 years go perfectly, irrevocably still. "Adrian, honestly, you'd embarrass me just standing there. Stay home." "I'll take Sebastian." "This is not your kind of room." His wife, Fiona, did not shout it. That was the part he would think about later. She said it the way you'd tell someone they'd missed a step on the stairs. Matter of fact. Almost kind, in the way that costs the speaker nothing. What Fiona did not know, what she had genuinely never thought to ask about, in the way that people stop looking once they've decided what they're seeing, was that the man she had spent 3 years introducing to colleagues as her contractor husband held a 31% stake in the commercial real estate development firm she had just been appointed to lead. Thornfield Capital Partners, headquartered on King Street West in Toronto, the firm she called hers. That Friday evening, at Thornfield's annual investor summit at the Fairmont Royal York, she was about to discover what she had been walking past every morning without ever once looking at. If you've ever stayed steady while someone nearby decided you were furniture, stay here. This is that story. The first thing people noticed about Adrian Kowalczyk was his handshake. Not his build, though he had the kind of build that came from 2 decades of real site work. Broad through the shoulders, deliberate in the way he moved, a man who knew how much weight a structure could bear because he'd calculated it himself. Not his face, though it was a patient one, the kind that had already considered whatever you were about to say. No. The handshake first. Firm, dry, unhurried. The grip of someone who has nothing to prove and therefore proves everything. He had been running Kowalczyk and Feld Construction out of Hamilton since he was 31. Started with 2 crews and a white Ford Transit with a cracked side mirror that he'd kept for 7 years past its useful life because it was paid for and it worked. By the time Fiona was interviewing for the Thornfield position, the company had 4 divisions, 93 employees, and had broken ground on 11 commercial builds across Ontario and Quebec. He had not mentioned this at her interview dinner. She hadn't asked. Psychologists call it the halo effect in reverse, a kind of cognitive narrowing where an initial impression becomes so fixed that contradicting evidence simply doesn't register. Fiona had met Adrian at a job site open house. He'd been wearing a hard hat and work boots and explaining load-bearing specifications to a city inspector. She had formed a complete picture of him in approximately 4 minutes, and in the 3 since she had never substantially revised it. The oil on the hands, the early mornings, the language of lumber and concrete rather than equity and leverage, fast, efficient, and spectacularly incomplete. It was a cold Wednesday, the kind of November cold that arrives in Hamilton like an old argument, familiar, resigned, already tired of itself. The oaks along their street had gone the color of rust, and the last of the leaves were coming down in slow, indifferent spirals. Adrian had been on site in Stony Creek since 6 that morning, structural inspection on a mixed-use complex that had hit delays in the 3rd phase. He'd resolved the issue by noon, and spent the afternoon walking the crews through a revised timeline, patient, specific, never raising his voice, the way he did everything. He came in through the side entrance, set his keys on the hook by the door. He heard voices before he saw anything. Fiona was in the front hall, standing before the tall mirror, the one she'd had shipped from a showroom in Yorkville, because nothing else had quite the right proportion. She was in a black gown, hair up, earrings catching the light. Beside her stood Sébastien Morel, 31, the firm's new head of investor relations. He was in a charcoal suit that had clearly been fitted, and one hand rested at the small of Fiona's back with an ease that was not professional. Nobody moved when Adrian appeared. Then Fiona turned. Her gaze traveled over him once. The work jacket, the scuffed boots, the fine coat of sight dust that never entirely washed out, and her expression did something careful and controlled that was somehow worse than if she'd looked annoyed. Adrian. She said his name the way people say it when they've already moved past the conversation. You don't have to come tonight, actually. Please don't. Sébastien understands this world. He fits the room. You'd spend the whole evening trying to, and that's exhausting for everyone. She reached up and adjusted an earring in the mirror without meeting his eyes. You're a good man, you work hard, but tonight isn't for that. The door closed. The hall light hummed. Somewhere down the street, a car idled briefly and moved on. Adrian stood for a moment in the silence she'd left behind. Then he walked upstairs, showered, dressed with the specific patience of a man who has already decided something and no longer needs to debate it. The charcoal suit had been at the dry cleaner on Lock Street for 2 weeks. He'd picked it up quietly, without mentioning it to anyone, the way he did most things. He checked his father's watch, a Longines, with a worn leather strap that kept perfect time, and went down to the garage. He pulled the dust cover off a dark gray Audi A8, folded it with the same care he gave everything, set it on the shelf. He had a seat at that summit. He had always had a seat. He just hadn't decided until tonight to use it visibly. Here is what Fiona told people when the subject of her marriage came up in professional settings. He's steady, dependable, the kind of man who's wonderful at what he does. And she would smile in a way that closed the subject gently but completely, the way you close a door on a room you don't plan to show. Psychologists call this benevolent minimizing, the particular mechanism by which we reduce someone's dimensions not through cruelty but through managed softness. He's so dedicated to his work, it's actually sweet how much he loves the trade. The generosity of the framing is its own kind of cage. You are being praised for the thing that keeps you categorized. She was not wrong about the dedication. She was simply missing the entire picture. Adrian had been 28 when he first crossed paths with Harold Feinstein, the original founder of what eventually became Thornfield Capital Partners. Not as an investor, not that initial year. As the construction firm that broke ground on Thornfield's first 2 commercial properties in Burlington. Harold was 71, meticulous, old school in the best possible sense, the kind of man who remembered what he'd promised and to whom, and never required the other party to remind him. When Harold moved to restructure Thornfield's capital base 4 years later, he called Adrian directly. "You've built 3 of my buildings," he said. "You've always come in on time and under budget, and you've never once asked me for more than we agreed. That's rarer than equity. I want you at the table, not just on the site." The arrangement was quiet by design, private investment structured over time, compounding. By the year Fiona joined Thornfield as regional director, Adrian held 22%. He never mentioned it. It wasn't evasion. It simply hadn't seemed relevant to who they were as a couple. Or so he'd told himself, which was its own kind of thing to sit with. By the time she was appointed CEO, he'd added 9% more in a secondary offering that 3 board members knew about and nobody else did. 31%. Majority block. The largest single holding in the firm she spent her days running. She had not the faintest idea. She believed with the genuine conviction of someone who has worked incredibly hard that Thornfield's stability was entirely a product of her leadership, and she was partly right. Her skill was real, her performance was real. The numbers she had moved in 3 years were real, but the floor beneath her feet had been set and kept level by the same man she'd told to stay home. This is what psychologists identify as the fundamental attribution error at scale. We observe someone's style, their language, their surface texture, and we construct from that a complete theory of their substance. We never examine the foundations. We assume the visible structure is the whole structure. Fiona had never examined the foundations. 10 days before the summit, Adrian came home from a site walk in Dundas earlier than he'd planned. He came in quietly through the side door, the way he always did, and he heard her voice from the upstairs office. Low, precise, the register she used for calls she didn't want overheard. He wasn't her first call tonight. Sebastian knows how to manage the optics. The marital assets will be straightforward to separate. The house is technically both of ours, but the equity is clear. Once the filing goes through, we move quickly. We'll be in a much cleaner position. Adrian stood on the landing. Not with shock, precisely. With the particular quality of stillness that comes when something you've been sensing at the edges for months finally arrives in plain language. And you realize that the instinct you'd been questioning was entirely correct. She hadn't been drifting. She had been planning. He understood something in the quiet of that landing that he had been reluctant to fully accept. Fiona's fear of being ordinary. The fear that had driven her out of a small-town Sudbury upbringing, that had made her relentless and brilliant and exhausting in approximately equal measure, had long since stopped being a source of drive. It had become a lens that distorted everything it touched, including him. Psychologists call this scarcity orientation, a cognitive pattern in which the fear of not having enough becomes so habitual that it begins to reshape how a person sees everything around them. People who love you quietly become risks. Constancy becomes stagnation. The man who shows up every morning becomes the thing holding you back from the version of yourself you're always almost reaching. Fiona wasn't a cruel woman. She was a frightened one, and frightened people, over time, can do things that feel to them like strategy. He walked back out to the garage, sat at the small desk in the corner, the one with coffee rings and the old wall calendar, and thought for a long time. Not planning, just becoming clear. 2 days later, he drove to Guelph, a family he knew through one of his site foremen, Claudine, recently widowed, 2 kids in high school, 1 semester away from having to pull the older one out because the numbers simply didn't work. He showed up with enough to bridge the gap, left it in an envelope with the foreman, and said nothing else about it. On the way home, he stopped at a gas station in Aberfoyle and left a sealed bag of groceries by the food bank bin at the entrance. No note, no return address. These were not performances. They were just the shape of the day for a man who understood that what you do when no one is counting is the only accurate measure of who you actually are. That night he looked at the suit in the wardrobe, thought about Harold Feinstein, who had died 2 springs ago, who had told him at their last dinner that the best thing about quiet people is that they almost always surprise you when they choose not to be. He picked up his phone and texted Genevieve Marlowe, Thornfield's chair of the board. "I'll be attending Friday. Save me a spot at the main table." The response came in under a minute. Already on the list. Has been since the agenda was set. The Fairmont Royal York has a way of reminding people of themselves the moment they step through the entrance, the height of the lobby, the particular quality of marble that has absorbed a century's worth of occasion, the sense that whatever you've brought into this room, you'd better mean it. Some people walk in and rise to it. Others walk in and calculate it. Fiona arrived at 7:15 with Sebastian half a step behind her. The black gown moved well. Her posture was precisely calibrated. She worked the room in the measured, intentional way she did everything. Warm without being open, authoritative without being stiff. It was impressive, genuinely. The performance was real even when the substance behind it was starting to thin. When a senior board member named Patricia asked after her husband, Fiona offered the practiced tilt of the head she used for professionally inconvenient subjects. He had work commitments. He understands these evenings. Patricia's smile did not entirely reach her eyes. She moved on to the next conversation. Nearby, 2 junior investment directors exchanged a glance. Wasn't her husband supposed to be here? One of them shrugged. She usually doesn't bring him to these. Sebastian accepted champagne from a passing tray and smiled the way people smile when they are certain they are exactly where they should be. Dinner was served at 7:45. One chair at the main table remained empty, reserved card face down. Genevieve Marlowe, seated at the head, had not explained it to anyone who asked. At 8:30, Genevieve rose and tapped the side of her water glass. The room settled with the quiet efficiency of a group that has been trained to attention. Good evening. Before the formal program, I want to make a recognition that I've been looking forward to for some time, and that is long overdue. Fiona set down her fork. Something in the cadence registered. I'd like to invite to this stage the individual who has been, since Thornfield's first difficult year of capital formation, its most consistent and principled financial partner. A man I have known professionally for over a decade and personally for longer than that. A man of uncommon patience. She looked up toward the back of the room. Adrian Kowalczyk, please come. 3 full seconds of silence. Then heads began to turn. From the far side of the ballroom, moving through the space without rush, came a tall figure in a charcoal suit. Walking the way a man walks when he has nowhere to be but exactly here. Fiona's hand went still on the stem of her wine glass. Sebastian leaned toward her. Is that? Don't, she said. Flat and quiet. Adrian reached the stage. He and Genevieve shook hands. The grip of two people who have kept a long agreement and kept it cleanly. He stepped to the microphone. Let the room settle on its own without engineering it. My name is Adrian Kowalczyk. I run Kowalczyk and Feld Construction out of Hamilton. Most mornings I'm on a job site before most people's alarms go off. A small, warm current of recognition moved through the room. 12 years ago, through my relationship with Harold Feinstein, I began providing capital support to Thornfield during a period when this firm had considerably more vision than operating runway. What started as a structured private arrangement converted over time into equity. Over the years, I have invested just under $22 million into this firm. The murmur that moved through the room was not theatrical. It was the sound of people recalibrating. I'm sharing this tonight because recent events have made continued anonymity no longer appropriate. As of the second week of this month, following a secondary offering, my total holding in Thornfield Capital Partners stands at 31%, making me the firm's largest single shareholder. The room did not erupt, it went still, and in the stillness, almost involuntarily, most faces turned toward Fiona Kowalczyk. She did not move. She did not release the wine glass. Her expression was technically composed and structurally compromised at the same time, the way a facade looks the moment before the scaffolding is removed. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance collapse, the instant in which the internal story a person has maintained becomes so incompatible with the evidence in front of them that the mind cannot hold both at once. For 3 years, Fiona's story had been I built this. He managed the house and the site schedule. That story had just been quietly and thoroughly dismantled in front of approximately 200 people. I'm also announcing tonight, Adrian continued, the establishment of the Kowalczyk Trade Scholarship, a fund supporting young people from working families in Hamilton and the surrounding region who want to enter the skilled trades and construction industry. My father immigrated to this city at 24 with $400, basic English, and a set of hand tools. He believed the only things worth building are the things that last. He stepped back. The applause began somewhere near the middle of the room and spread, the kind that doesn't wait to be socially sanctioned, that comes from actual response. Several people were standing before they'd consciously decided to. At her table, Fiona sat perfectly still, while the version of reality she'd constructed reorganized itself around a different center of gravity. Sebastian leaned close, voice stripped of its usual professional gloss. Did you know any of this? She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Adrian took the empty seat at the main table, the one that had been reserved for him from the start, and sat down. What Genevieve said next about Sebastian, about the due diligence report that had been quietly filed 2 weeks prior, and about what Adrian had done without telling anyone for Fiona's mother in Sudbury, was what made 3 people in that room leave the table briefly to compose themselves. A different quality of quiet had come over the ballroom, not silence. Conversations had technically resumed. The service staff continued to move. Someone near the south wall was describing a Q3 outcome that nobody was tracking, but underneath all of it was a stillness that had not been there an hour before. The kind that settles in when a room has witnessed something it's still privately processing. Fiona sat straight-backed, 12 years of professional habit keeping her surface intact. Sebastian had refilled his glass without appearing to notice. Across the room, Adrian sat at the main table, speaking in low, unhurried tones with Genevieve. He was not looking in Fiona's direction. Somehow that was its own statement. Psychologists call it anticipated regret, a particular form of pain that isn't about what has already happened, but about the sudden, clear recognition of what you have done and cannot undo. The filing Fiona had been preparing, the timeline she'd shared with Sebastian, all of it still existed, sitting now inside a context that had completely changed shape around it. She was the CEO of a firm in which her husband was the majority shareholder. She had been planning to use the divorce process to claim his assets. At 9:15, Genevieve returned to the podium. "I apologize for interrupting again. There is a matter of fiduciary responsibility the board determined should be addressed transparently, this evening, in front of the people it concerns." She nodded to the AV station. A document appeared on the projection screen, structured, detailed, the kind that accountants recognize before they've finished reading the header. Over the past 14 months, Thornfield experienced a pattern of irregular billing through a third-party vendor account registered in Mississauga. A forensic review, completed 3 weeks ago, traced $1.9 million in fraudulent disbursements to the individual responsible for investor relations and external communications. She looked up. Sebastien Morel. The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Sebastian's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, calculation. Something attempting to look like confusion, before settling into a controlled blankness that was doing a considerable amount of invisible work. His hand on the wineglass was not completely steady. Slowly, with the deliberateness that makes an ordinary turn of the head feel like a verdict, Fiona looked at him. This was a different expression from the one she'd worn earlier. That had been the shock of a narrative collapse. This was something colder, the recognition of a woman who has just understood that the person she chose to believe in had been using her, carefully and consistently, as a vehicle for access. This is what researchers describe when they examine manipulative personality patterns in professional contexts. Self-interest packaged inside social performance, so polished it reads as loyalty. Sebastien had not chosen Fiona because of her. He had chosen her because of what she could reach, what accounts she could authorize, what oversight she could inadvertently provide. The board has referred its findings to the relevant financial authorities, Genevieve said. Mr. Morel will address these matters through the appropriate legal process. She paused. But there is one more thing I need to share tonight, and I'll ask Adrian to speak to it. Near the east wall of the ballroom, at a small table among the auxiliary seating, sat a woman in her late 60s. A dark wool blazer, neat but worn at the cuffs, silver hair, hands folded with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to waiting and not being waited for. Her face was the kind that had absorbed a great deal without broadcasting any of it. Her name was Lorraine, and she was Fiona's mother. Lorraine had raised Fiona alone in Sudbury, working shift work at a hospital records office for 19 years, driving 40 minutes each way in winters that do not forgive inattention. She had taught her daughter through sheer demonstration that you fight for what you want because no one is going to hand it to you. She was the source of Fiona's drive in a way that Fiona understood abstractly, but had spent 20 years outrunning. She was also, 22 months ago, midway through a diagnosis of early-stage kidney disease that had moved faster than the specialists had initially projected. The treatment costs, specialist consultations in Toronto, a specific medication protocol not fully covered by provincial health insurance, travel, accommodation, follow-up monitoring, had created a gap that Lorraine had not told Fiona about in full. Because Lorraine understood her daughter well enough to know that the admission would have created more damage than the gap itself. What she had not known was what her son-in-law had done quietly, from a distance, without mentioning it to anyone. Adrian returned to the microphone. 20 months ago, I established an anonymous medical support fund through a private health foundation. The fund was directed toward covering the treatment costs for a patient in Sudbury receiving specialist care in Toronto. The travel, the medication, the consultations, the accommodation, everything the provincial coverage didn't reach. He paused briefly. That patient was Lorraine. Fiona's mother, complete silence. I did not tell anyone. I'm sharing it now because honesty, when it finally arrives, should arrive completely. Not to embarrass anyone, but because the full truth is the only ground worth standing on. He looked, briefly and without drama, in Fiona's direction. Her hands were visible in her lap, pressed together, trembling slightly, visible from across the room. I covered her mother's care, he said, while my wife was preparing documents to separate my assets. The room did not react with satisfaction. It reacted with something considerably quieter than satisfaction. Something closer to collective moral reckoning, the experienced psychologist Jonathan Haidt describes as moral elevation, the specific human response to witnessing genuine, unrewarded virtue made visible. A warmth in the chest, a tightening in the throat, a feeling that is not comfortable but is unmistakably clarifying. Near the east wall, Lorraine stood. She moved through the tables, and people stepped aside without being asked, the way people do when they recognize something real is happening. She walked to the edge of the stage. Adrian came down the steps to meet her. She put both arms around him and didn't let go immediately. Her voice came through the open microphone, small and exact and absolutely clear. I knew it was you. I didn't know how to say it. Thank you for my life. He held her without saying anything. Which was the right thing? Which was the only thing? At a table near the windows, Patricia, who had chaired 3 board meetings in the last fiscal year, without once visibly losing her composure, appeared to be studying the floral arrangement in front of her with an unusual degree of concentration. Fiona was crying. Not the controlled kind, both hands pressed to her face, shoulders moving, the surface she had held all evening finally and completely gone. Beside her, Sébastien Morel, with $1.9 million of fraud accruing to his name, and a lawyer he would need to call in the morning, had nothing useful to offer. The man who understood this world, the one who fit the room, who belonged at this level. Publicly and permanently diminished. Later, near the coat check, Sébastien attempted to explain himself to 2 board members who had not asked. I had a system. I was going to correct the accounts by Q1. I had it managed. One of the board members looked at him with the specific patience of a person who has heard many explanations and is not hearing one now. You were expensing client dinners from a ghost vendor account and telling people you were up for a VP title. What were you managing, exactly? Sébastien had no answer. Adrian found Fiona in the lobby near the corridor to the elevators. She had rebuilt the surface by sheer force of habit, spine straight, eyes clear, the particular composure of someone who has been performing professionalism for so long that the muscle memory fires even when everything underneath has gone to rubble. She saw him coming and didn't look away. He stopped in front of her, not angry, not forgiving. Simply there. You told me I didn't belong in that room, he said, quietly, without heat. Look at what Sébastien was doing in that room. There's a difference between belonging somewhere and performing like you do. Tonight, everyone in that building saw the difference. He collected his coat. He walked out into the November night, cold, clear, the kind of night that makes Toronto look like something worth building in, and he drove home to Hamilton. What followed didn't arrive all at once. Consequences rarely do. They come the way Canadian winter comes, gradual, gray, a slow dropping of temperature you register only when you realize you've been cold for a while and can't quite remember when it started. Sébastien Morel was terminated by board letter delivered to his Yorkville apartment 3 days after the summit. His lawyer advised full cooperation with the financial investigation, which Sébastien provided in the way people provide cooperation when they are hoping the number turns out to be smaller than it is. The number did not turn out to be smaller. By February, he was navigating a formal RCMP financial crimes referral from a sublet in Etobicoke. The charcoal suit, the fitted shirt, the language of someone at the top of something. None of it had any load-bearing structure. Remove the signals, and there was nothing underneath to hold the shape. Thornfield Capital Partners was in difficulty. The fraudulent disbursements had disrupted 3 vendor relationships. 2 institutional partners had paused commitments pending an internal review. The CFO's report in January used the phrase operational liquidity concern. Fiona received it on a Monday morning and understood exactly what it meant. She also understood who had the capacity to address it. The divorce had been filed in December. Adrian had not contested the house, had not complicated the process. He moved without ceremony into a century-old brick house on Aberdeen Avenue in Hamilton. High ceilings, a porch that faced the street, neighbors who said good morning because they meant it. It suited him in a way the glass and marble Ancaster House never entirely had. The emergency board meeting was called for the 3rd week of January. 12 people, 1 agenda item. Adrian came alone. Same suit, same watch. He placed a proposal on the table. Specific, structured, covering the shortfall, providing clear runway, protecting the employment of the 241 people whose livelihoods had been peripheral to every decision that brought them to this room. 1 condition. It was in the 4th paragraph, and Fiona understood it before she reached the period at the end of the sentence. As a condition of this capital commitment, the current CEO will step down, to be announced in a full staff meeting, in person, with transparent communication about the circumstances of the transition, not privately, not through a curated press statement, in front of everyone. The distinction matters, and it's worth naming clearly. There is a real difference between punishment and consequence. Punishment is personal. It satisfies the person delivering it. Consequence is structural. It restores integrity to the institution, not just in the individual who compromised it. Adrian was not trying to humiliate Fiona. He was requiring that someone who had publicly performed authority accept accountability for its failure with the same visibility she had expected for its success. That is not cruelty. That is a consistent standard. 11 people at the table studied the proposal with careful neutrality, waiting for the only viable outcome. Fiona picked up the pen. She signed. The announcement was made 4 days later in Thornfield's main boardroom, full company attendance via video. Fiona stood at the front in a dark blue blazer. No gown, no armor, nothing performative. She read a statement she had written herself, with a steadiness that cost her something visible. When she finished, the room held a moment of silence and then offered the complicated, honest applause of people who have watched something require courage even when it was compelled. Adrian watched the live stream from Hamilton. He did not applaud. He sat with his hands in his lap and watched the screen with the expression of a man who takes no satisfaction in another person's diminishment, even a fully earned one. Psychologists call this equanimity, neither vindictive nor passive, simply clear. It is one of the most difficult emotional states to sustain, because most people, when they have been genuinely wronged, want either revenge or reconciliation. Equanimity asks for neither. It asks only that things be what they are. Adrian had been practicing it, in one form or another, for most of his adult life. In the months that followed, Fiona learned a specific and unsentimental lesson about the difference between professional relationships and personal ones. A lesson that most people who have confused the two eventually learn, though rarely all at once and rarely in full view of their industry. One afternoon in March, she drove to Hamilton, parked on a side street near Kowalczyk and Feld's main office, sat in the car for a long time. Then she went in. Adrian was in the back, walking a young apprentice through a blueprint review, pointing, explaining, asking questions rather than providing answers, letting the younger person find the logic for themselves. The apprentice was focused, slightly uncertain, exactly at the stage of learning where everything depends on whether the person teaching you believes you can do it. Fiona stepped into the room, her shoes on the concrete floor, the smell of clean work around her. Adrian looked up. She didn't prepare a speech. She had spent months preparing speeches, and this was not the moment for one. She said his name. She said she understood, now, what she had missed, not just what he was, but what she had been in order to miss it. The fear underneath everything, the running. The way she had mistaken motion for direction for most of her adult life. She said she was sorry. In the specific actual way, not the strategic way, not the way that manages the other person's response. The way you say something when every other version of the story has been fully exhausted and only the true one remains. Adrian set down the blueprint, straightened slowly, looked at her for a moment with no particular expression and no particular absence of one. "You told me once that I was a good man but not the right man for the room," he said, quietly. "Look at what room we're both standing in right now." She had no answer. There wasn't one available. He handed her the apprentice's blueprint, not as forgiveness, just as a practical, ordinary gesture from a man who is decent even when he has no obligation to be. Then he turned back to the apprentice and continued the lesson. 1 year later, November had come back to Hamilton the way it always does, gray and unhurried, the kind of cold that is more honest than unkind, the oaks along Aberdeen Avenue, down to their last color. Adrian Kowalczyk was standing in the main bay of the Kowalczyk and Feld Training Annex, a building he'd converted from an old auto body shop 2 doors down from the main office, because the space existed and the need existed, and those 2 facts had seemed sufficient reason. He was working through a structural load calculation with a 19-year-old named Darius. Sharp, impatient in the specific way of people who are genuinely capable and haven't yet found a use for patience, who had been raised by his grandmother in the East End and had not previously been told by anyone in a professional context that his thinking was worth developing. "You're not just reading the blueprint," Adrian told him. "You're reading what the building is going to need before it knows it needs it. That's what takes years to build. The calculation is the easy part." Darius looked at him sideways. "That sounds like something from a motivational calendar." "Those exist for a reason," Adrian said. "People just forget that someone had to actually live it first before they could write it down." Darius considered this. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, okay." Adrian handed him the grade pencil and didn't say anything further. The Kowalczyk Trades Scholarship had, by this point, supported 18 students through certificate programs at colleges across Ontario and Quebec. 4 had already started their own operations. 2 were working on Kowalczyk and Feld sites. 1 had called Adrian last spring, not for work, just to tell him that he'd signed his first independent contract and he wanted someone to know who would understand what it meant. Adrian had understood. He'd said so. He'd asked about the contract terms and the client and the scope, and listened for 20 minutes, and said very little except what was true. He taught the Thursday morning session himself every week. He intended to keep doing so as long as it was useful. Not because he needed the students to know he was the one funding the scholarship. Most of them didn't, and that was fine. But because he needed them to see that the person who owned the building showed up in work clothes and got under things and asked questions. That the distance between where they were standing and where they were going was real but not mythological. That the most valuable thing about any given Thursday morning was showing up for it. His father had taught him this without once articulating it. Adrian intended to pass it on the same way he'd received it. And then, in the way that things arrive when you've stopped watching for them, there was Caitlin. Dr. Caitlin Beaumont was a structural engineer with an academic appointment at McMaster and a consulting practice she ran out of a small office on Hess Street. 40 years old, precise the way people are when they've spent 15 years thinking about how things hold together, with a particular quality of attention. She listened the way engineers listen, tracking the structure of what you were saying rather than just the surface of it. She had heard about the training annex from a colleague and arrived one afternoon to ask whether the curriculum needed an updated structural assessment module. Adrian was on the phone when she came in. He finished the call, set down the phone, and she handed him a printed copy of the current module with margin notes in mechanical pencil. Your load calculation methodology references a provincial standard that was revised 2 years ago, she said. These students will walk onto sites using outdated assumptions. He looked at the margin notes, detailed, specific, correct. You want to revise the curriculum, he said. I want it to reflect current practice, she said. Those aren't the same thing. He had smiled. The real version. Come back Tuesday. She came back Tuesday, and the following Tuesday. And by December, they had gone through every module in the program and also through 4 dinners at a Lebanese restaurant on James Street North, where the food was excellent and the conversations consistently ran longer than either of them had planned. She never asked about the Fairmont Summit. She'd heard the outline the way you hear things in a city where everyone eventually knows enough. It simply wasn't relevant to what she saw in front of her. She understood clearly that who a person is and what they've been through are related but not the same category. What she saw was a man who arrived before his staff every morning, who called his site foremen by their first names and knew their children's names, who, when asked what he was most proud of, paused for a genuine moment before saying, "There's a kid who called me last spring to say he'd signed his first contract. That's what I'm building toward." She had set down her fork. "You're a good man," she said. "I hope you know that." "I'm a decent man," he said. "On a good day." "That," she said, "is exactly what I mean." Lorraine called Adrian every Sunday. She had started, after the summit, calling him something she had never called anyone outside her immediate family. She called him son. She meant it more each week. He always picked up. He always had the time. On a November evening in Ancaster, not his old street but a new one, which is often how it has to go, Adrian Kowalczyk sat on the porch of his Aberdeen Avenue house with Caitlin beside him, a thermos of coffee going cool between his hands. The maple at the end of the walk at full amber, the neighborhood settling into itself at the end of a working day. It was ordinary, specifically, deeply ordinary. The kind that you only recognize as remarkable when you've spent enough time without it to understand what it's worth. He thought about his father, about what it means to build something that lasts, not the structure itself, but the intention underneath it. The decision to put your hands to something real, stay with it when it's hard, and keep going when the only person watching is you. That decision, made quietly and held consistently over years, doesn't make for good headlines. It doesn't fit neatly into the stories people tell about success. But it is, in the end, the only kind of building that holds. He thought about Darius, who had arrived frustrated last Thursday and left focused. Because the most useful thing in the world is sometimes a problem you're actually equipped to solve if someone simply shows you how to begin. He thought about the 18 names on the scholarship roster and what some of them would build. He set down the thermos. He recognized, not triumphantly, not with relief, but with the specific clarity of someone who has finally stopped comparing the life they have against the life they were supposed to want, genuinely content. The kind that doesn't need an audience. The quiet, solid, constructed from the ground up kind. The story this leaves behind is a quiet one, and specific. When the person closest to you decides, without looking carefully, that you are not worth looking at carefully. That moment will either hollow you out or clarify you. The difference, for Adrian, was not willpower. It was the Thursday mornings, the blueprint sessions, the sealed envelopes. The phone call he took in April, from a kid who had signed his first contract and needed someone to know. He did not wait to feel worthy before he acted worthy. He acted, and the worthiness was already there. It had always been there, built one ordinary day at a time, in ways that no one was watching and no one needed to applaud. The people in your life who go quiet, who work without announcing it, who give without keeping a record, look at those people again. Look carefully, because the ones who make the least noise are very often holding up the most weight. And if you are the one who has been quiet, if you have been building something real while the people nearest to you looked past you towards something that glittered more, do not change. Keep your hands on the work. The foundation you are laying will outlast every assumption anyone ever made about you. The truth does not need your help. It only needs your patience.